This is my helmet that I wore, or a replica of the helmet that I wore in the movie. It was produced by a guy called Charles Hecton, who lives over in the States. And I have to say, it's pretty damn good. It looks exactly like the other one that I have. I remember very well filming with Excalibur. I was 12 or 13 years old, and we were filming it all in and around where we live in Ireland. It was a huge movie, and it really pushed the boundaries of what Ardmore Studios and what people wanted to do in Ireland. And it was bizarre. I mean, I remember sitting there talking to Dad, and he would be talking about horses and what type of horses you could use. In the end, we ended up using polo ponies because they were very used to having close contact with each other. It was the American style rein, but with an English saddle. So the memories are extraordinary of how much we were there. You know, my whole family was involved, from my mother to my sisters to everybody. Well, I think my father, over the years, he's got 4 children. Myself, my twin sister Daisy, and Katrina and Talsha, and we all worked in all of his movies. And I think most of the time he would say, "Don't employ any children. I have 4 that will work for free." And so that started in Deliverance. So my first appearance in a movie was when I was 4 or 5 years old. And when John Voight comes back at the very end of the film, back to his wife, there's a little boy sitting on the sofa, and that's me. And I'm not the banjo player, just so you know. And so that was kind of cool, that part of it. And then with my sister Katrina, she was a budding actress. She played Igraine in Excalibur. And Talsha was Lady of the Lake. Her hand was Lady of the Lake. Daisy, my twin sister, was never interested in being in front of the camera. She didn't like any of that part of it, and still doesn't like that part of it. Whereas Katrina and myself, just love this side of the camera. As someone who's 12, 13 years old, to be given a full set of armor and to play an evil character, was brilliant. And there was so much fun. I mean, there was all this thing you had to train, you had to get your horse accustomed to armor. I mean, my horse was just hilarious. I mean, if you think about it, back in those days, it was all 35 millimeter as well. So, film was expensive as well. Whereas now, it's all digital now. So it's not such an issue anymore, but it was. And then, there's all these other things as well where you look at it and, if you want an arm chopped off or something like that, you had to actually chop an arm off. And Dan he wanted to get some blood and guts in there in the battlefield, and this extra turned up with one arm missing, and he thought, brilliant. I got this guy, put a false arm on him, put some tubes with loads of blood, and then this horse comes by and chops his arm off, and all this blood comes out. Back in those days, there was no CGI. Whatever you filmed, whatever trick you wanted, you had to film it, and it had to be made there. Dad was going to do Lord of the Rings at one stage, and they were trying to figure out how they could get thousands of extras onto the thing. So Dad had this idea of getting sheep and putting stuff on the sheep and just having them in the field so that, it looked like there were thousands of people, but it was actually sheep dressed. It was a brilliant idea and would have worked. But in the end, I think Dad decided to not do it because, the technology wasn't quite there. I remember Terry English was the first time that Terry had used aluminium instead of metal, because the practicalities of it and the expense of using aluminium was the two were completely different. And as well as that, if it got damaged, you could easily fix it. I remember spending days at a time on these big fight scenes, and you'd he would shout cut, and you'd go running in with these little leather thongs, and you'd go and you'd run and you would tie all the bits of armor back together again, and then they'd go off and do another scene. And they loved it. I mean, these guys would come in with their swords and they'd really hack the shit out of each other. I mean, it was, you had to put the brakes on and say, okay, guys, just don't kill each other. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look back at that film as well, there's quite a cast of people, and all of those people, Helen Mirren, Liam Neeson, the list goes on of all these people who've been given their first film, and people. Whenever I meet people who talk about Dad, and they Liam or Helen Mirren, I saw a little while ago, she was saying, the amount of people that my father has saw something in them and pushed them a bit more. If it was a cameraman, he'd say, well, why don't you do the lighting as well? Why don't you do the whole lot? And he's always seeing the skill in people and pushing them to be better people, and an incredibly generous person. And he's one of the few people that you see who takes great pleasure in watching people succeed, and very selfless about the whole thing. I think it's lovely that people want to, or have the enthusiasm to digitally remaster a film, and I think it preserves these films for the future, for people to see it how that director wanted it to be seen, and in some cases better, and because of whatever the technologies were in the past. And I think there's been a score of Dad's movies being done. Deliverance, Excalibur, Point Blank has just been done as well. You forget who the guy is, Sir John Boorman, and he shaped cinematic history. He shaped how people make movies, and Tarantino is one of the people who will always talk about him and say that he was Point Blank and Deliverance and Hope and Glory and all these films were something that helped shape how he approaches movies. So I think it's lovely. I think it's lovely that they're preserved. I think it's lovely to be able to sort of have this in your hand. And I think if you're sitting down to watch Excalibur for the first time, I do think it's a genuinely great interpretation of the Arthurian legend, and I think it was cast beautifully, and has great depth and feeling and meaning.